We had the pleasure of speaking with Jess Thompson. Jess runs an organization called My Grateful, which supports refugees and asylum seekers to... I think ultimately it's about building a kind of sense of belonging, which I think we touched on a little bit in the conversation. And Jess is one of the few people that I know who brings a really beautiful balance of honesty and directness, but also of kind of compassion and listening. And she's really an extraordinary human doing really tough work.
She is one of the most courageous humans that I've met. Like, I think that she has just got like such a fighting spirit. It's beautiful to watch, really, independently of whatever position you take towards immigration or not. I think it's definitely like something that you can learn from this.
Most certainly, yeah. Cool. We're here with Jess Thompson, who is a good friend and the founder of My Grateful, which is an organization that supports refugees and asylum seekers, and the immigrants themselves, or the refugees and asylum seekers, teach their native cuisine in cookery classes to people here in the UK, in London, and soon in Bristol. Is that right? And Jess is you are a real force, and you actually have somewhat recently been named to the new Radical list in the UK, which is a Nesta and Observer list, or I guess the Observer is the part of the Guardian. Mm-hmm. Is that right? Which is a big thing, I think. No. I don't know.
Apparently.
Please explain for the viewers.
Yeah, what is this? Yeah, what is the new Radical list? What does that mean?
I think it's the 50 best social enterprises in the UK, which have been selected by a panel of judges.
Okay, cool. Did you get to speak to any of them, of the judges?
No.
Do you know anyone who was on the panel?
Josh from Cracked It was on the panel.
Josh Babarinda.
Yeah.
Yeah. Josh, also a force to be reckoned with. Soon to be MP, I'm sure, somewhere. Well, thanks for coming, Jess. It's good to have you. How long have you been running My Grateful?
Since June 2017.
Okay.
So a bit, 2 years in June.
Okay. And where do you feel you're at now with it? Where is it in its life cycle, do you feel? Where are you at? Maybe that's a better question. Where's Jess?
I think since Christmas it's changed to like a different gear where we're selling out of all our classes, which we hadn't been doing previously, so that's quite exciting. We're now a charity, so we've got a few grants, which has meant that the finances are quite stable, which is also a new thing for us. So it feels like the future is bright for My Grateful at the moment.
Do you want to explain also that the fact that you actually didn't start off as a charity? Do you want to let us know how that happened?
Yeah. So founded My Grateful as a company, mainly because I'd done the Year Here Fellowship, which is how I met Nathan. And they're kind of... The idea is that you build a business which also helps people. And so that was kind of the original thing that we were trying for My Grateful. But because we run this training program alongside the cookery classes, food is not a particularly profitable industry. So it was really hard to do what we wanted to do and help people in the way that we wanted to and make a profit. It felt like that was a contradiction. So then after a lot of different talks and indecision, decided to convert to a charity in the summer.
You said there was a contradiction and about making money and feeling like you were making an impact. What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, some of our cuisines sell a lot better than others. So Syrian, Iranian, Lebanese, Afghan cookery classes will sell out within a few days. Whereas our Albanian, Nigerian, Gambian cookery classes, we sometimes have to cancel them because we don't get enough people booking onto them, which is probably a lot to do with the fact that people don't know what those cuisines are. But when you're trying to run a company, you're kind of thinking, how do we make enough money to cover our costs? And so you end up kind of only helping Syrian chefs because they sell well. Sure. Whereas now that we're a charity, we're able to kind of think of everyone's needs. Okay.
Yeah, because I guess in that case, right, you've got a couple different users. One is, or groups of people who are using your service. One is the refugees and asylum seekers themselves, who you're supporting in one way or another. And then there's the people who are coming and eating, right? And as a business, and if they're paying, 35, 40 pounds a dinner, that dynamic, I imagine, could be quite challenging. How were you able to work with the chefs initially on that? What was your mindset when you were a business and you felt like you had to have some conversation about selling classes but also that I'm here to help you in some way?
I mean, it's probably worth saying that even as a charity, we're still a business. I think it's just when you're a business trying to do stuff to help people, there's no grants available to you because people see it as like a for-profit outfit, which was quite frustrating at times because the idea of being a company is that you can actually then grow in a much more efficient way rather than being reliant on grants. Right. But you always need grants at the beginning to support you.
Right. There's almost a bit of a catch-22 there then. Yeah. As a social enterprise. Actually, a lot of social enterprises that I've seen need a lot of runway. Yeah. You almost need more runway in a sense because of the number of stakeholders and the complexity of the needs of the stakeholders, right? Yeah. So you found that actually we need some help, and no one's really gonna give us.
Yeah, I mean, so that's one reason, but actually, I think for me it was more thinking about what do I want to achieve with this organisation. So there's kind of two groups of impact that we're trying to achieve. One of them is to improve the lives of our chefs, so help them to get out of isolation by making friends in the cookery classes, practice English, get employability skills, feel empowered and celebrated, and that's all going really well. And then the second bit of impact that we're trying to achieve is shifting perceptions around migration through our sort of theory for change is contact theory. So the idea that if you attend a cookery class taught by a refugee chef, you're going to have a really positive interaction with them, you're going to share some food with them, and that can really challenge the prejudice that you might have felt beforehand around migration. And actually at the moment our cookery class is all selling out, and that's kind of left-wing demographic that are buying those tickets, and people that are already very sympathetic.
They're on board
to the plight of refugees. So we're not really achieving our second aim at the moment, but we're applying for grant funding so that we could go into more deprived communities and offer the cookery classes for free.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's quite positive that you're trying to just not just keep that you're sort of already the client base that you already have and that you're trying to expand and just like actually make this thing something more tangible and real for the people that maybe don't see things that way, or that don't see refugees and in as much of a positive light as
I think that's often driven by poverty, because if you've had a lot of, I mean, where I first piloted My Grateful was in the Meadows estate in Hounslow, which is one of the poorest council estates in the UK, and I knocked on all of the doors in the council estate for many times over about a month, and I was inviting them to this community event to eat curry that had been cooked by an Indian resident, and that was the first time that I came into contact with sort of white British population that felt extremely resentful about the rate of migration in their area. And what they kept saying to me was, you know, my daughter can't move onto the estate anymore because all these migrants have arrived and they've taken our housing, they've taken our benefits.
Yeah.
You know, we're really poor and we don't have enough resources to share with these people. So it kind of, that experience really helped me to understand why the Brexit situation had happened, and it is driven by poverty a lot of the time.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think they were concerned about? Those people that you spoke to in Hounslow.
I mean, the sort of comments they said to me were, "Oh, have you seen the migrants that have moved onto the estate? They have such nice trainers. They have iPhones. They don't need this the way we need it." So it was this feeling of, you know, why is our government allowing all these people to move in when actually we don't have enough already to share? It's
an interesting thought, because people that I have spoken with in East London on one particular piece of work, which is looking at people who've accessed housing services, some of the not even white British, but just people who've been in the borough or been in the neighborhood or in the local council for 5-10 years, felt like they had built up some level of social capital. I mean, they talk about, I've been here for 10 years, my dad's done this in the neighborhood, I've been here, I've contributed, I've paid taxes. And there is some sense of, there is a sense of duty that the council or that the government owes me, because I've contributed it in some way, not just financially, but I've established trust here, I've established connections, I know the place really well, and I deserve some level of care that I don't think I'm getting, which I think is fascinating, because I've heard it also from people who've moved here. So one woman, for example, she lived in Holland, she grew up in Holland, originally from Somalia. Her mom was a refugee, and then they moved to the UK, but grew up in Holland, lived here for 15-20 years, and also had a similar sentiment, like, hey, I've been here for 10 years, I've contributed to the community, and what's happening? There's a disconnect, Yeah. Which I think I think there's some credibility to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so too. It's you can't just. I think that there's a big problem that I think a lot of people think that a lot of people voted Brexit because of some sort of racism and I think that it's way more complex than that. At least that's not the feeling that I get from the people that I talk to. I don't know whether you guys agree or.
Well, I think it's incredibly complex.
Sure, there are some people which think like that. Fair enough, but I don't think that's why the whole country decided to go in this direction. I mean, that doesn't make sense. There's not enough people.
I mean, I think part of the issue is that during austerity they've cut all the funding for initiatives which actually facilitate integration. So you have huge migrant communities moving into parts of London. For example, Tower Hamlets, which has a huge Bengali population, but then
it's 40%.
Yeah, but there's not a lot of initiatives which actually allow people to mix and for them to learn English. For example, they've cut the English teaching budget.
Yeah.
So there's not.
And then if you can't integrate and you can't communicate, then of course you can't contribute, and then that creates resentment on the other side, and so it's just
Well, you just. My grandparents, my mom's immigrated from Italy when she was 2 to California, and my grandparents, her parents,
ended up living in California for, I don't know, over 40 years, and I never really had any depth of conversation with them, just because we just couldn't. And my grandfather lived till he was 99, so I was of a considerable age. I mean, we could have had some depth of conversation, and they never had to. They just, well, they weren't educated. I don't think they were even educated in Italy, but they ended up just kind of relying on their Italian community. So they went to the local church where there were Italians and plenty of Spanish speakers, so they could get by on that. And they always had Italian friends over, and I think this is similar to what happens here with particularly with Bangladeshis and Somalis in Tower Hamlets.
Or the father is the only one in the family that does speak English, or
and they just become reliant on that community and on that enclave to have a social life and other things that come with social capital. And especially because it definitely wasn't happening in the US, where you had, integration is part of the kind of is part of the American story. It almost like, I think it's almost like we take it for granted, and because you were working in East London, and also you've worked in some capacity in migration and in refugees with refugees and asylum seekers for some years now. So you would have seen some kind of movement during this time of austerity, where you have less and less for people to access, and for people to find their way outside of their enclaves. What did you notice towards the end, like working at you worked at a community center, for example, just before you started My Grateful?
At the Bromley by Bow Centre. Yeah. I mean, what I found interesting was actually like the Bengali community, because I was also living in Poplar, so I would go to my local shop, everyone there speaking to each other in Bengali, and wouldn't necessarily be able to communicate with me in English. And then you go to the library, and the person who's like the librarian also speaks Bengali. So you've effectively got like a kind of ghetto of the Bengali community. And quite a lot of people that I would speak to would say that's, they're actually having a great time in some ways. Like I think there's also there's a danger of us saying, oh, these people need to learn English, these people need to integrate. And then the question is, well, that's, whose problem is that? It's a problem for society as a whole, but is it also a problem for them? Or so that's.
Then we should create some sort of incentives so that they would feel like inclined to learn.
Yeah, I mean, I think it becomes an issue in terms of employment, because if you don't speak English, your employment opportunities are quite limited.
And more and more so. More and more so as manual labor becomes automated or is whatever sent abroad, or you need it more and more. You need to have some skills. Which is actually a really good question, because I mean, in terms of what should integration look like? Because I know for a fact that that's something that My Grateful is asking itself all the time, is how are we supporting integration, right? There's a collection of people coming from all over the world to our kitchens, and what are we doing besides putting them in front of strangers to cook for them, to support them, to build a sense of belonging and a sense of place in London, in the UK? And actually, it's a really good question. Well, what is integration? And for who? For whose sake? For central government's sake, or because actually I just think of my grandparents, and I think they had a lot to say about where they lived and the land that they worked on, even in California, and how they contributed to local economy, and the friends that they made. Even if there was a language barrier, there was still a warmth, there was still a Mediterranean familiarity. And is that not integration, even if they didn't speak the language or
That's
didn't
a fair point.
have some intimacy.
But then there's also this thing that for me I always found it a bit strange that second generation Americans, they tend not to speak the mother language and they just speak English, like that's your case, for example.
And I was the youngest of 20 grandchildren and not a single one of us spoke Italian. I mean, there's a real kind of like semi-causal effect of that, of like being dark-skinned Southern Italian farm kids showing up in California in 1959 and not feeling welcomed in a lot of ways, and feeling like you need to distance yourself from the mother culture, the motherland. So that it makes perfect sense. I don't know what the feeling is in the UK though around immigration, kind of historically. And again, America, I think it's built into our story. It's inherently built into our DNA. What defines the country.
Yeah. I know from interviewing a lot of people on this council estate, one of the things that particularly the white elderly population said to me is before it was like 100% sort of white British population, and now it's 40% white British, 60% migrant population. So, and that's all happened in the last 20 years. So it's a very rapid change for them. And they said that they brought up on a council estate where it was mainly kind of Christian celebrations. So it's like Christmas, Easter, everyone would be there, and there was a real sense of community cohesion. And since kind of they talked about the Sikhs arriving, the Muslims, they all had their different celebrations and they didn't invite them. And it was kind of a moment where I felt a bit of compassion for these elderly women that said, like, we never get invited to the Muslims' parties. And for them, it kind of came down to they felt this loss of community or this loss of friendship because it wasn't something that they could join in on.
They almost felt, I guess they would feel some sense of otherness, of like exclusion, and in their own place where they grew up. Which
that must be a very strange feeling.
And I think also like the drasticness that you mentioned is interesting as well. Like at what point is kind of like a sudden high level of diversity, what point does it go beyond being useful? Like diversity, and there's tons of academic literature and we just kind of know inherently that a mix of different perspectives, mindsets, points of view, cultural experiences is all really important to a healthy team or a healthy
and for growth,
improvement, for fresh perspective and learning. And I think there is a question to be asked about like a level of diversity that is beyond something that is
positive,
positive, right? Like almost like a bell curve. Like there's got to be a point at which, especially when it's so drastic, where it's uncomfortable for people. And change is difficult.
But I think what I was observing is that there were no initiatives to actually allow people to meet for other reasons. So like if there'd been a community centre there where there'd been a chance for everyone to come together, then those issues could be addressed. But instead there was just like divisions between all the different groups.
And
I guess also like where
there's so many barriers. It's like it's the language, it's then religion, then the community, and the fact that they're both kind of a little bit afraid of each other because they don't know who these people are. I mean, that's why it's such a complicated and strange situation. I think.
There's a lot of variables.
From what I've heard and read about it is that there is like, it's mostly a good thing when there's a mixture of cultures, but then there needs to be time for integration, because if you integrate too fast, then these sorts of things start happening and people start getting actually more separated than
I think especially when people don't feel like they've been part of that process. So like I think the same thing happens with development as well, and building and construction. So when you live in a community and all of a sudden there's this like building going up, and it's just next door to you, and you've got no idea why this building has ended up there, that can be really difficult for people. And I don't think we fully understand how difficult change is for people, and especially when they haven't been part of the process. You feel like, I think there's a real feeling of powerlessness. There's a real feeling of hopelessness in some sense, or ambiguity, like what else is going to pop up, and why haven't I been part of that process? And I've lived here for 20 years, and it almost feels like a similar process is happening in development, and also like with migration, and how people just kind of, communities just change. They can change quite rapidly. And how are we including local communities in that process? I think that question's not, from what I've seen or read or heard, I don't think that question's being asked. I don't know if is that even being considered, you know?
I mean, where I live currently is in a community centre in Elephant and Castle area.
Which is in South London.
Yeah, South East London, and it's literally crazy the rate of gentrification that's happening. Like,
yeah.
Exactly what you were just describing. A month ago, I kind of did my normal walk from the tube station, and it just suddenly realised that there's new buildings everywhere.
Yeah, and I think Elephant and Castle is notorious is a notorious case of development gone not very collaborative way. Which is what we talked to Jan and Jeff a little bit about.
Yeah.
So another guest. Yeah, but you can sense it as well. And you've been there for 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite shocking.
What kind of conversations then do you have with the chefs about these type of topics? Is there an opportunity for you guys to discuss these things, and what's their perspective? And these are the refugees and asylum seekers.
On gentrification or integration.
Yeah, just generally their presence here, how they're engaged with, how they feel like they have and haven't been kind of brought into the country.
Yeah. Well, so we run our chef training group every Tuesday, and I'd asked Nathan to come in a couple of weeks ago to do a workshop with our volunteers, and there was an exercise that we started with, which was everyone had to close their eyes and think of a moment where they felt integrated, and it was a really interesting thing to think about, because everyone had a very clear moment, often related to family, and I reflected on the fact that I felt quite emotional thinking about a moment where I felt a real sense of belonging.
Yeah.
And that we also talked about the fact that actually that integration, you normally associate that with like migrants needing to integrate, but actually we all need to integrate within our communities. It's like a human need to feel a sense of belonging.
Yeah.
And that was quite a nice thing to reflect on, that everyone that's involved in My Grateful is trying to achieve the same aim, which is to feel belonging to this community. So I decided to do the same exercise with the My Grateful chefs on Tuesday. So we all closed our eyes and thought about this moment. And as we went around the room to share, 7 people started to just weep, which wasn't what I was expecting.
Just you were probably thinking, oh, this will be great. Like, this went really well with the volunteers.
Yeah.
We'll do.
Hire Nathan will make everybody cry.
Yeah. And afterwards I thought, well, that's really obvious that it was going to be a real emotional trigger, because I mean, they talked about my moment where I felt the most belonging was when I was with my 2 children, and I haven't been able to see them for 10 years because of the war.
Yeah.
And then the next person said, I haven't seen my family for 20 years, and that's when I felt the most belonging. And then as they started to cry, then 3 of the volunteers started to cry because it was so upsetting. And then the next person
as we chuckle, yeah.
said, yeah, I mean, it's
it's funny because you must have been like, what the hell's going on? Like, why did I do this?
And then the next person said, you know, I've never felt belonging in this country. The Home Office don't want me here. They want me to leave.
Which if the Home Office heard that, they'd probably be like, yeah, we've done our job, you know.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. So then one of the
Unfortunately.
volunteers started to cry and said, "I'm so sorry that you're living in such a horrible kind of hostile environment, which is what the Home Office want."
yeah, that's what I mean when I say
Yeah.
that the Home Office would be happy
Yeah,
to
they
hear that,
want to
because
create
they've
hostile
created this
environment.
hostile.
But I mean, if you think about it, just the fact that they did have that experience together, like in My Grateful or at My Grateful, that just creates a level of connection that, like you don't normally show your feelings to strangers like that,
Yeah.
and when something
So-
like that happens, then obviously that creates important bonds.
So I was thinking, how do I save the situation because everyone's crying? And
That's a good thing,
I
though.
thought so I wrote our mission statement on the whiteboard, which is to empower and celebrate migrants on their journey to integration.
Oh, brilliant.
So I said, don't worry, everyone, you can stop crying because we are gonna give you this sense of belonging.
Well,
That's our aim.
I mean,
That's
yeah,
what we're
I mean,
trying to help you with.
When I hear that story, that just sounds to me like a moment where everybody just like was connected, and at least I don't know whether if integrated, but definitely like it sounds to me like a moment that will be cherished.
Yeah, especially when you hear that you're not alone. When you hear that, oh, okay, shit, like they haven't seen their family in 20 years.
Yeah.
You haven't seen your kids in 5 years.
Yeah.
And there's people here that have a similar story to me, and that's why now I can have a real friend, because they really do understand what I'm going through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing that you did that. There's only been one time where I kind of questioned the design of a workshop or like gathering, and that was with a collection of there was a collection of parents who had been through the family court system, and you can imagine what it's like when you're struggling for your child, and people experience real trauma, real anger, and I did something similar, but I wanted them just to think about gratitude. I just wanted to put them in a mindset of gratitude and appreciation, because I knew there was so much anger and so much frustration and some level of anxiety and trauma in the room. And I said, I just want you to even pinpoint a second, pinpoint a split second of when you felt some relief, or you felt some gratitude, or you felt even just like a moment of thank you for someone, for something in this process. And one lady, really, she couldn't do it. She couldn't do the exercise. And I thought, I don't know if I might have messed that up. But I think it was still, most people, I mean, almost everyone in the room could think of at least a moment where they felt like someone helped them. There's always helpers,
But I think if you don't confront people with something like that, then there can't be any space for reflection and for possible growth.
Yeah, the only problem is when you're dealing with traumatized people, you do have to be careful not to re-traumatize them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
So,
The only thing was that she just shouldn't have been in that workshop, because it wasn't the space for that. I mean, that wasn't the intention. The intention of the workshop wasn't to cathart and to be a kind of like a therapeutic session necessarily. And I think that particular person wasn't there for the right reason. And that's also our fault as facilitators, but or we're partially responsible for that, how we communicate what we're trying to get out of the session. But I think you're right, there it is also an opportunity for people in I thought a safe way to challenge that, but I think it sounds like it was at least it was useful on some level. Or did you feel it was useful, or would you have done it differently?
I think it was a bonding moment. I think the only thing I would have done differently is to make sure that we were all sitting in a circle facing each other, and maybe just created a slightly more safer environment.
Collective.
Welcoming sort of, yeah.
And also because that exercise was just meant to be a little introduction.
Sure.
But then I think when it brings up those kind of issues, you then need to maybe do a next exercise to take it somewhere.
What did they say to you when you wrote the mission statement up?
Yeah, I think they liked that. But I mean, it's quite an important part of running My Grateful for me is including them in the design process.
Mm.
So we've had quite a lot of these chats where I'll talk about our mission statement. They help to actually write the mission statement, and what we're trying to do is help you to integrate. How do we do that? What does integration mean to you?
Yeah.
And some of the things that often come up is, well, we can't integrate because the Home Office won't let us. And then we're trying to look, obviously, as an organisation, My Grateful can't do anything about the Home Office. So how do we empower them despite the circumstances?
Sure. It's a really important question, I think, is do people in the organisation give a shit about the vision, and have they helped create it? And also B, what do these words mean to people? And what does integration mean to people? What does respect mean to people? What does place and belonging mean to people? I think that there are probably oftentimes taken for granted these larger words, or these like maybe more abstract words.
Yeah, and because in the mission statement, to empower and celebrate, so we were unpacking the word to empower.
Yeah.
Like, what does it mean to feel empowered?
We talked about this today a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, giving agency to people, I'm imagining, has got to be a big part of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess how did people define that?
Well, they felt it was really difficult because when you have no control over where the Home Office are gonna like move you to, like they can move you up north within a second, whether they're gonna let you work. So the whole experience is disempowerment
and stressful.
Yeah, and I think that's where My Grateful offers this microcosm of empowerment just in an evening where they are the leader of the cookery class and they're telling people what to do, and they literally have all the power in that moment.
Yeah. And I saw, I mean, in the last time that we met for the for where all the chefs got together to make like a big event, that chef, what was his name? Habib. Like he had like a moment there that he was just like, it was just super grateful that he'd found you guys, and like he was just super happy to share it with everybody. And that's just like it really felt like it was quite meaningful to him, and I just thought that if you can create that sort of feeling of belonging with everybody that joins you, then you got that part of your plan completed.
Yeah, it's interesting because the chef training group, it costs us like £500 a week to run. There's moments where I think, this is not actually an essential thing for the cookery classes, for like the business aspect. But in terms of creating belonging and a community, it's so important, because that's where when you ask them, why do you love My Grateful, they all talk about this family and like the closeness that they feel with everyone.
What the empowerment thing is really an interesting topic. We were talking about this earlier because one of the clients that I work with at the Bromley by Bow Centre, actually, one of the things that we discovered in the work that we did with them, which was engaging some of their beneficiaries, was around the balance of empowerment. So like you can do things for someone, or you can do it with them, or you can have them do it, right? They just do it on their own, or they just come up with their own things and then they do them. So there's some kind of like spectrum of autonomy or authority. And what we found was that some people, depending on wherever they're at that particular moment, may not want to do something that you've given them, or that they just don't feel like they're in the place to do that for whatever reason. And that empowerment is some kind of fluid thing that really depends on where that person is at in the day or in the month or in the year, and has to be really flexible actually, and has to be really particular to whoever you're working with. And one instance was one woman, they asked this woman to make a phone call for herself, like call the local authority, tell them that you need this thing, go. And she said she wanted to walk out. She was like, oh, no, I'm not ready to make that phone call. And actually she was so upset about it. that she didn't want to come back to the service. She said, I feel more disempowered, and I feel more anxious about my situation, and I also feel reluctant to get more support. So an opportunity where we thought we were empowering someone, actually we've done the complete opposite, and because we weren't present in the moment. So anyways, the point being is that these words are, as you were saying, it's really important that you give the beneficiaries, you give the end users opportunities to actually discuss what that means to them. What does integration mean, actually? Oh, it's this thing that you can't control. It's the home office or whatever. Well, we need to rethink the word then, maybe. Or we need to have a discussion about how My Grateful supports that, you know. So I think it's a valuable exercise, anyways. What's the next step then? Do you feel like for My Grateful? Where you said since the holidays, it's you've been booming.
Yeah, I think the next step is kind of doing what we're currently doing better, like thinking about what do the chefs need, what do the customers need, looking at how we can replicate why is it going well in London, and how can we do that again in Bristol and Kent, where we're currently looking to expand, and then also expanding into deprived communities and kind of starting to measure our impact, because we haven't really done that. Yeah.
The impact thing is really interesting because, again, you're talking about kind of like potentially nebulous words like integration and empowerment. What's the discussion that you guys have had around, well, how do we know we're doing a good job, and actually like do we need to even measure that? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think when you speak to any of the My Grateful chefs, they love it, which means that I've never felt that much of a need to measure the impact, because I'm like, just speak to them. It's working. I mean,
I think that's what Martin Luther King did too.
Yeah, it was what I was saying.
He's like, just go speak to my people. They'll tell you what's going on.
Yeah.
No, just the fact that
like
Habib did that.
Habib's speech, for example, he said, "You've changed my life. You've given me a family. You've given me a purpose. You've made me feel useful." All of them speak about how much it's changed their lives, because before they were at home, like not feeling at all welcome in this country, and that's changed everything for them. And everyone who joined My Grateful at the beginning, they've either left because they've gone on to full-time employment, which is the ideal thing, or they've stayed because they don't have the legal status to work and they absolutely love it. In other words, no one has really wanted to leave, which for me in itself shows that it's working. But I think when you're talking to funders, measuring your impact is good, having some kind of like real evidence. And I think
it's good because they want to see it.
Yeah. But the other thing is looking at to what extent we're shifting perceptions around migration. I think we could definitely find a way to measure that. We're starting to do a lot of cookery classes in corporates, which I think is a good opportunity to change perceptions. And you might get like an IT company, like 50 white males who their events manager books us for a few cookery classes. They would not have chosen to come to a My Grateful cookery class themselves, but they find themselves in a situation where Lola, the 73-year-old Cuban chef who doesn't really speak any English, is teaching them salsa, and they're having a great time.
They've got no fucking choice but to like Lola.
And they realise they absolutely love Lola.
Yeah.
And that, that they might go home to their wife and say, I had this really great experience with this Cuban migrant, and
which is already like a shift of the paradigm for them, because they're like, well, actually she wasn't from Syria, she was had a lot of energy, was really warm, like everything that you have been told that immigrants are not, Yeah. Interesting. What's the How do you get into working with refugees and asylum seekers? What was that? Where did that start for you?
So I lived in Mexico for a year. I was studying Spanish, and I was in Guadalajara, which was one of the stops on the train that goes all the way from the south of South America up to the US border. So I think that was like my first interaction with the scale of the migrant crisis, with these kind of like developing countries being pulled to Western countries, because I was just seeing trains after trains of people sitting on top of this train heading to the US. My overall sense was, I don't think they're necessarily going to be happier in the US. I mean, are they, you've got this dream of, the American dream of going to find work. I mean, maybe they would, but there was a lot of people that would fall off the trains, get injured, so I was helping to like give bandages to people that had fallen off, and so I kind of saw it in as like quite a this is quite sad. There's a lot of people that have left everything to make this journey. So that was that was my first interaction with the global migrant crisis. I then, after I graduated from university, I'd studied French and Spanish. I was applied to teach English for the British Council and was placed in a Spanish enclave in North Morocco, which is called Ceuta, which I was kind of annoyed about because I knew nothing about it. It seemed like quite a weird place to live. Any Spanish person you speak to says, "Oh, that's not Spain. It's not a very nice place."
It used to be part of Portugal.
Ceuta.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Did you indicate to them that you were interested in immigration at all? Or?
No. So the other thing about Ceuta is that you won't really find anything online, or especially not in any English kind of news. I mean, it's in the Spanish news quite a lot, but no one's heard of the sort of migrant crisis in Ceuta.
The first time I ever heard of it was from you.
Yeah. So I arrived there, and
because it's on the African continent, the northern part of Morocco.
Yeah.
The nearest part to Spain.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is owned by Spain.
Yeah.
Right under Gibraltar. Is that right?
Yeah. So it's like a 45-minute ferry to Spain.
Is that
It's
close?
the northernest point of Africa. Yeah.
You can see it. You can literally see it from.
Can. It's weird because you can see Gibraltar, Spain, and Morocco whilst you're standing there. So you've got like 3 countries in one.
Wow.
So I arrived there and discovered a very acute migrant crisis. So you'd have mainly West African migrants that would travel to this border. They've got a huge fence. As soon as you've climbed over the fence, you get European citizenship, as long as you don't have your passport with you, because the Spanish government can't prove where they've come from.
So you just have to get over the fence. Once you hit the ground, you are instantaneously an EU citizen.
Yeah, so you'll have a migrant from Senegal who will climb over the fence and say he's from Cameroon. So the Spanish government ring up Cameroon saying, "We've got one of your citizens, we're going to send them back." Cameroon say, "That's not our citizen, he's got nothing to do with us." Under international law, it's now Spain's responsibility. Because, they can't just force them back into Morocco. Morocco say it's not our problem
We don't
anymore.
want them.
So then they have like 6 months of waiting, and then they'll be allowed onto the mainland, but they're kind of kept in Ceuta. It's really hard to climb over the fence, so what they normally do is organise themselves so that 200 of them will storm the fence at the same time.
How high is the fence?
Like really high, like I'm gonna say 40 meters.
40 meters.
Whoa!
No,
What?
40
meters. That's like a castle. That's like a 10-story building.
Okay.
So wait. So like, what? So the Olympic height of the diving board is 10 meters, right?
Okay, it's about 20 meters.
Oh, that's still massive.
That's still pretty big.
No, it's maybe 15. And either way,
Is it higher than the high dive? Like when you go to the pool and they've got the highest
No,
high dive?
the high dive is 30 meters, if I'm not wrong.
yeah, I think it's about 30.
Is that 30 meters?
Yeah, that's 30. Yeah.
I thought it was 10.
No.
This wall is like 2 meters.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, listeners, don't listen to him. He's American. He
Is
knows
it?
nothing about.
Oh, we know yards, man. Yards and meters are like
Um,
same thing, man.
So anyway.
Oh,
about-
anyway, so it's like
So-
20, 30 meters.
But
It's
about
fucking tall.
100 of them will get over. So you've got the Moroccan police that are like beating them down to stop them climbing over the fence. They're paid by the EU to be very aggressive in these situations.
Yeah.
The Moroccan
um,
police
Yeah, and then you've got the Spanish police.
on the other side.
But the problem is that once they've landed, there's nothing the Spanish police can do. But they often get lots of injuries. And then on the other side, you've got a lot of migrants coming over by sea. And they wait till the sea is really stormy so that they can't be seen by the Moroccan sort of boat
Coast
patrol.
Jesus.
And then you've got like 50% of them will die from drowning on their way over. So I went to funerals of people that couldn't be identified, so you couldn't tell their family where they'd come from, that they'd died. So those experiences really affected me. I was doing a lot of translation work because I spoke French to the migrants, and then the NGOs were Spanish speaking. So it was quite an amazing experience. There was a real sense of victory for them when they just arrived. For them in Europe, like this is what they'd wanted. And yeah, it was very touching. There was one particular moment where I was running a weekly music group. So a lot of them were like extremely good at drumming, singing. We met on a Tuesday evening and just had a jam. And they kind of made up this song together, and the chorus was "A Mother, One Day I'll Return." And I knew that, like, for a lot of them, because once you're in Europe, if you leave, then you won't get back in.
Yeah.
So they probably wouldn't see their mothers for like 20 years.
But they were becoming citizens though when they arrived.
No, it's a bit more complex than that.
You mean the people in Ceuta?
They wouldn't become citizens, but they would be allowed onto the mainland, and then they'd have to apply for citizenship.
Yeah, they don't become citizens, but you just can't like do anything else. They just have to go through a process.
As long as you stay in the Schengen area.
Yeah.
Like, so they could have gone to Italy or to
I think they have
France
to stay
or...
in Spain for 2 years, and then they can move on.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was the understanding from the NGOs in terms of people's experience once they got over the fence, and did the NGOs understand what people's kind of life projection was for the next year or two? Like, did they know where people went, what they did, how they survived?
They'd normally be linked up with other organisations on the Spanish mainland, where they would go and kind of be helped to learn the language, given accommodation.
Yeah.
But a lot of them found it quite hard to find work when they were in Spain.
Oh yeah, even Spanish can't work in Spain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had friends who had masters, and they were like they could barely get waiting jobs in the last. Like,
Welcome to Mediterranean Europe.
What happens here in the UK if I'm a refugee or an asylum seeker? What's my experience like in the UK in terms of...
Because what you originally asked me, what was my experience with refugees? So I was saying, I had this experience for a year
Sure.
in Ceuta, and then went to Dunkirk refugee camp, where you have
in
like,
France?
In France, one of like the richest countries in the world, you have families living in absolutely terrible slum conditions. That was very shocking. And then a lot of them, the way they would get to the UK would be like hiding under a lorry, like these crazy journeys.
Yeah, like 12, 24-hour journeys under lorries.
Yeah. So it was kind of interesting experience.
Lorries being big trucks.
Yeah.
Diesel trucks. Like what?
What do you mean under them?
We call them Mack trucks. We don't call them lorries.
What do you mean under? How would they do that?
Like literally, like they would hide by the wheel, like clinging on.
What, like just holding?
There's one guy that I spoke to, my grateful. He was saying that you basically lay your back on the axle.
Oh wow.
And then there would be like a bar there for you to lay your legs over. So essentially you've got some kind of something here on your back and something on your leg. So you're basically, your butt and your midsection is dangling above the highway.
That's insane. Oh my god.
And the guy that I spoke to, he was underneath the lorry for, I think he said something like 16 hours.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Because these lorry drivers, they don't stop driving either.
Yeah.
They're just going.
Oh my god, it's scary. So yeah, I think then after this huge journey arriving in the UK, you meet the very hostile environment. So you probably don't speak the language well, you don't know anybody, you're not given the right to work, so it makes it extremely hard to integrate and kind of get out of isolation. We had some really amazing news this week in My Grateful because our Nigerian chef Betty, she arrived to the UK when she was 16 and she's been waiting 19 years to get her status. So all that time, unable to work, unable to participate in society, just feeling more and more frustrated. But we heard, on Monday night, she got a call from her lawyer to say that she'd been given her status.
Oh man!
Oh, wow.
After 19 years, so
what a
it's
wait.
amazing. Yeah.
How did she feel? What did she say?
I mean, so as we went round in this workshop where 7 people were already crying, we got to Betty and she said, I've got some news, I've got my status. So then there was like more people that started crying, so it was some unbelievable news.
Wow.
It's amazing.
Yeah, and her
Yeah.
story is particularly
Yeah.
awful. It's
It's crazy.
It's
19
really
years.
Some of these
Yeah.
stories are extraordinary. How did she? What was she able to do in that time? How was she able to survive? What did she?
Well, I met her through Housing Justice, which is the homeless charity I was working for before. So they host migrants who are in this situation, and you receive a destitution fund. So like
from them.
yeah, I think she was actually getting it from another charity, but £25 a week, which is not much to like pay for your basic needs.
What do they end up doing? It's asylum seekers then who are unable to work, right?
Yeah.
So these are asylum seekers are people who've come to the UK or to Europe and then have claimed that they are seeking asylum, that they have come from a place where they could be in danger, they're in trouble, they're potentially at risk of death or.
Yeah, I mean, actually, in Betty's case, she wasn't seeking asylum. She was just seeking like an immigration status.
Okay.
What's the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker?
So refugee status is when say a Syrian person arrives in this UK, they are seeking asylum from the Home Office because they are saying like it's not safe for them to go back to their country. Once they're offered kind of asylum, they then become a refugee.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's just a legality
Yeah.
term. Or it's a term of legality.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a refugee, you're further ahead in the process, basically.
Yeah. I mean, a refugee means that you have been given permission to seek refuge in this country.
You've been acknowledged as
Yeah.
refugeable.
What is the what are the processes there? I'm guessing there's a vetting system somehow.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our chefs have been waiting like 10 years having been just like thinking one of our chefs in particular, her whole family, because of their religion, were persecuted against. Most of her family were killed. She escaped to the UK. She would be killed if she went back to her country in Eritrea. And the Home Office have said they don't have enough evidence for this.
And then it's just a matter of she's trying to find evidence to show to the Home Office that this is actually happening, and then
Yeah, but the problem is it's quite hard to find evidence.
Right.
When you're in the UK. Someone else who's like a victim of an attempted honour killing because she left an abusive partner.
Right.
But again, the Home Office say, well, you don't have evidence for this, but she would be killed by her family if she went home.
Right.
Yeah.
So what?
But it's so strange also from just playing devil's advocate here. But if you are a body of law in the UK, like, is there any other way that you can? Because you can't. I think that you can't also like take everybody's word for it. You know.
It's difficult though, because when I speak to them, like take Eritrea, it's like a known fact that Christians are persecuted in Eritrea.
Yeah, sure.
And she has evidence of being a Christian. Or the other chef that I was talking about with her family that want to kill her, she has proof of a disownment letter from her family.
And that's not taken into consideration because what could be fabricated or something like that? Is that what they are?
Yeah, I mean, I do find it hard to understand how they could reject it, but I mean, I understand that they need some kind of system, but it's hard when you're seeing the experience of these people that are suffering as a result of it.
What do you feel like My Grateful's role is in policy? How much do you feel like you want to or could have some sway in that regard?
So I think, as we spoke about before, our mission is to empower our chefs. So for a lot of them, we've done who are in a situation where they don't have the right to work and they're living that injustice every day. We've done workshops with them, and they've basically a broad workshop on what do you feel passionate about and what would you like to change if you could. And all of them have said, well, I'd really like to have the right to work. So we help them to devise a campaign to ask for the right to work from the Home Office. And there's already a campaign called the Lift the Ban campaign with a coalition of lots of different refugee charities. So we've kind of been joining that